You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
See some ladies in the crowd. Welcome. I think all of us can relate to this when we got our first car or our first boat or got our first assignment flying some airplane. We always wanted to go faster, didn't we? It never went fast enough. The gentleman today that's going to present was lucky enough to fly the fastest thing with wings. And I'm just going to let him tell his story. He's going to talk about the SR-71 Blackbird. So, Cal Augustin, everybody.
Good morning. I don't know if some of these, yeah. That's what I was going to say, turn the lights down. When I talk to my friends about how they got into flying and all this, they always tell me, well, you know, when I was young, I looked up, I always wanted to fly airplanes and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't one of those. I was one that was going to, my dad had a car dealership, and I was going to come back to North Carolina and sell cars, fast cars, because I like fast cars. So I went to the University of North Carolina, and I said, you know, I need a plan now. Vietnam is kicking off, and they're starting the draft and all that kind of stuff. I got to have a plan here. So I got to university, and I went to sign up for Air Force ROTC. Got over at Air Force ROTC, started into the room. They had about 250 guys there who had the same idea that I did. And as I started in, this redheaded major grabbed a hold of me and he says, I can't let you in here like this. I said, what do you mean? He says, you don't have any socks on. I'm going, geez, I really didn't know that was a requirement to get in here. He said, well, I'm not going to let you in. I said, okay. So I walked away and going, well, that didn't go well. So I'm walking back across campus, and I'd only been there about 3 days, and I saw a guy I actually recognized from my same dorm. And I looked down, and he had on socks, and I said, listen, I know this is going to sound kind of strange, but can I borrow your socks? I said, and what room are you in? And he told me the room he was in, and I said, okay, I'll get the socks back to you today, I promise. And so I put his socks on, and I walked back over, and as I started in, the redheaded major grabs a hold of me again. He says, I can't let you in there like this. I said, what do you mean? I got socks. He goes, yeah, but they're red. And I said, let me tell you what you can do with this course here. And I walked away, and I said, well, I guess I told him, well, it's now a year and a half later, and Vietnam is really kicking in, and people are getting drafted and all that. I had a college deferment, but that's as far as it went. So I walked over to the Air Force ROTC department, and I said, does that redheaded major, is he still here? They go, no, he got reassigned. I said, great. I'd like to sign up for ROTC. And they said, well, you got to be a pilot. I said, okay, I'll be a pilot. The rest is history. So I finished up at the university and went to Moody Air Force Base for pilot training. And My assignment out of pilot training was the B-52 Force Base, which has G models. So I didn't want to go to Vietnam, so I signed up and got a B-52 and ended up with 4 tours in Vietnam. That didn't work out too well, did it? So this is called the Tall Tail B-52, and that's me. So you can see why they call it the Tall Tail. Now, actually, they were flying this thing along the ridges of the Rockies and ripped the whole tail off the airplane. And that's when they found out that they really didn't need that big a tail on it. It didn't need any tail at all. So the next model, the G's and the H, have smaller tails, but this one started out with a big tail. So what was I doing in Vietnam? Well, there's Guam Air Force Base. A whole bunch of B-52s there. This is Utapao, Thailand. And that's what I was doing in Vietnam. The B-52 will hold 84 500-pounders internally and 24 750-pound bombs on the wings. It was an amazing load of bombs, and normally we didn't carry, yeah. Oh, look at this, I got an assistant now, I'm moving up. So here the guys are loading up the bombs. Next one. Yep, more bombs. These are all 500-pounders. Next slide. They're internally, 84 500-pounders internally. So the Gs, which they sent over when we really started doing a lot of bombing over there, held like 24 bombs. So we called them the mini bombers. We were the big dogs over there. We could carry 108. Next slide. There they are on the wings. Next slide. It's kind of blurry. Those are the 750s. Next slide. They're on takeoff. So we took off in groups of 3. We always flew in 3. This guy here is, he's trying to dodge all the smoke coming off the first 2 and the turbulence behind it. So with 3 airplanes, if you're flying over a heavily defended area, they can't break out where the airplane is. But if you're just a single airplane over there and you're jamming the sight, he can tell where all the radio interference is coming from. They're easy to shut down, so you shoot down. You always needed 3 airplanes, and that's how we flew over there. Next slide. There we are dropping bombs. Next slide. Yeah. We dropped the bombs in 5 seconds. And in 5 seconds, we had this thing they called the brick, and it would give a single impulse to each bomb. So when we dropped them, even though we dropped them in 5 seconds, they would spread out over 2 miles when they hit the ground. Next slide. It would just be a string mark. And we bombed lead airplanes here, 2s here, and 3s over here. Quite a lot of destruction. Next slide. There we are landing. That's Buddha Mountain there, going into Utapao, Thailand. Next slide. Okay, so I ended up in Vietnam. I flew 128 combat missions. I flew 54 over North Vietnam. And in the Christmas bombing of 1972, which we bombed 11 days, I flew 7 of them, which was a record over there. And that was only because the guys in the trailer next door to me were all killed, and so I was on a revenge mission after that. So I volunteered to fly when people called in sick, and we had quite a few guys that mysteriously got sick when we were doing that. Lost 5 airplanes the first night. Actually, a little bit before that, I flew the 3rd B-52 to get hit in Vietnam. It put 150 holes in the airplane. And no, I did not go out and count the holes in the airplane. But somebody did and told me there were 150 holes in it, and it never flew again. So after that, I was a T-38 instructor for 4 years. Next slide. SR-71. Next slide. I flew F-4s in the Guard for a little bit. Next slide. I went to work for U.S. Air right here locally. DC-9. Next. Bach 111, next. 737, and then I went back on the Bach 111 and the 737 and flew those both as captain. And then went into the training department. Actually, on the 737, I went in the training department. So I was a instructor and an examiner on the 737, the F100, next slide, the 757, next slide, 767. And after that, I hit 60 and was forced to retire. So after that, I went to work at Boeing. I worked for Boeing for 13 years, and I instructed on the 777 and the 787. Next slide. After that, about 3 years ago, I got a job with an outfit over in Wilmington, Ohio. It's Air Transport International, ATI, and they fly 757s and 767s. So I instruct over there on both those airplanes. So the next slide. There's ATI, and the next slide after that. That's what they do. So ATI is probably your packages are most of the time traveling on the 767s that Air Transport International has. And I'm still doing that today. As a matter of fact, I just came in from work on Wednesday. So let's go back and talk about the SR-71. So in the Air Force, to get an assignment, you would had a dream sheet called Form 90, and you'd fill out on the dream sheet what kind of airplane you wanted to fly. You had to make it kind of realistic, or your chances of getting it were not very good. But there were two airplanes I can think of, the Thunderbirds and the SR-71, and that's a special assignment, and you have to fill out a lot of paperwork to do it, and I'm not even sure all the guys knew that you had to do to get there. So you had to fill out a lot of reports that you had, ER reports, efficiency reports that people had written about you, and then you had to have flown two airplanes. One of them had to be a fighter, and one had to be you had to be able to air refuel, because they didn't want to spend any time teaching you how to air refuel. So a fighter, air refueling, I'd done those two. And fill out all the forms, and then out of the crowd of people that sent in, they would bring out 5, 6, 7 guys 1 week at a time. So you went in, you had a 2-day physical, more of a physical than I ever wanted. The third day, you flew 2 rides in a T-38. Well, as we saw, I flew the T-38, and I was the chief of stand eval in 38, so my rides went pretty well in T-38. Thursday was the day that you were in the simulator. So you start out in the morning, and they would tell you how to do a pre-flight the airplane. So then you would get in their simulator, and you would pre-flight the airplane, and everything was subsonic. So you come back, and now you'll have a 2-hour briefing on how to take off and how to climb. Go back in the simulator, do the pre-flight, do the takeoff, do the climb, get back out of the simulator, have lunch, then go back and we'll do the climb and descent, go back for another hour briefing, and then you got the last one, which is the how to land the airplane. So then you get into the simulator for the last ride. And by then, you're starting to really forget a lot of stuff, because everything was kind of different layout than what you're used to. So you flew that ride. As a matter of fact, on the ride was when I was coming down, landing on a instrument landing approach, I had these 2 little orange lights that came over on the right-hand side where the engine instruments were, and I went right through that ILS like it wasn't even there, and just flew around. I'm going, well, that didn't work out well. So I said, well, give me vectors for another ILS. And the second time I flew the ILS, I was a little better with the throttle control, and the 2 little orange lights didn't come on. And of course, I didn't know what the orange lights were anyway. So we got through, and the last day you had interviews, and then you left, and you didn't know whether you had the assignment or not. So I got the assignment, and I went back, and the guy who ran me through the sim workout was my instructor. So it's kind of a cool deal there. He got to choose which one of the guys that went through that he liked the best and did the best to come back in and get the assignment. And I said, listen, Bob, I can tell you right now, I said, I didn't know when I was taking that ride that I was getting inlet guide vane shift, and that's why I blew through the ILS, because I was all of a sudden getting a lot more power than I wanted. And I said, How many guys does that happen to? Because if you're really good with the throttles, you don't get that to happen. And he said, 60, 70%. I said, okay. I said, so what happens after that? He says, that's when it gets real interesting. He said, I like to see what the guys do under pressure, how they handle it, and how they coped with the situation. He said, I had guys just raise their hands, just said, okay, I was supposed to land, I didn't land, slide it, jump out of the simulator, and all that kind of stuff. So that went well. So then I went into training, and for training it was 4 months of classroom and simulator. And after 4 months of classroom and simulator, then we started flying in the airplane with an instructor, and we flew 6 rides with an instructor. The 7th ride was a check ride, and then on the 8th ride, you went on your solo ride, which is you and your navigator. And I don't know why they call it solo, but that's what it was. Okay, so let's talk about, next slide. Yep, there he is. Next. Okay, so what's the standard day like? So we would come in 3 hours before the flight, and you would get a half-an-hour weather briefing. That's probably 28 minutes more than I wanted to hear. I mean, I really didn't care what the temperature was at 70, 80,000 feet. It just, and the thing is that when I went in for the weather briefing, I knew I was going to take off no matter what he said. So I'm going, okay. So anyways, half-an-hour weather briefing. The second thing we did, believe it or not, is that we went over and had our last meal there. So this is the last meal, and it was usually steak and eggs, and I had to pay for it, which was, I thought, pretty interesting. Anyways, and it was a low residue meal. I'm not going to explain that, but it was a low residue meal. And after that, then you went over to the suit room. Next slide. And you took a physical. So you went in there, they took a physical before every flight. And after the physical, then, and that is Fearless Frank, my navigator. Didn't have cell phones then, so nowadays I'd have a million slides, but now, these were actually taken with somebody. Okay, next. And then you got into the suit. So to get in the suit, actually the zipper starts about your navel and goes all the way up your back. It doesn't come down like this, so it's difficult to get in. Believe it or not, those 2 little things you see sticking out right there, that's part of the air conditioning system to get air down to your hands. So if your hands were sweaty, your palms are sweaty, and you actually had blowing air over your hands, because the gloves are really heavy and really dark, and not dark, but they're really heavy. Next slide. And you do a pressure check. Again, that's Frank getting pressure checked. And you can see how thick and heavy those gloves are. And after that, then you go out to the airplane. Next slide. Reclining chairs. You know you have made it when they take you out to fly a flight and you go out in a reclining chair. You have made it, okay? Next slide. There's your we had a portable air conditioner in the summertime. Next slide. There's 2 guys I don't know who they are, getting ready to fly. And next slide. Still, I couldn't get over the reclining chairs. That's why I put it in twice. Next slide. Okay, so then they get you in the airplane. This is not the way we normally got in the airplane, but you can see this stand up here that they pull up along it, and that's where the airplane is shaped, and you look at it head on. The fuselage comes down like this, and it flares out like that, and then it flares back in, and that lifting body all around the airplane is called the chine. So that stand goes in over the top of the chine, and the technicians get you into the airplane. They pretty much lash you into the airplane. When you're getting ready to crank up, we used JP7 is the fuel we use. JP7 does not ignite with a regular igniter plug. So if you put a fire out there, if you had a campfire or anything like that, and you poured JP7 on the fire, you could put the fire out. It would not light. So it really, the reason is that you would use it as a heat sink and cool down things on the airplane by pumping this gas around, because it wasn't very flammable. The next thing you did was, as the fuel went down in the tank, you put in nitrogen on top of it, because nitrogen is an inert gas, and you don't have to worry about it setting on fire. They talk about that a little bit in the with that 747 crash that they had, that they took off out of JFK, and the airplane blew up. And then the newer airplanes, like 787, doesn't have liquid nitrogen on board, but they have a nitrogen generator that they pump in nitrogen on top of the fuel just to make sure it's not flammable. So we had nitrogen on board, liquid nitrogen. We had liquid oxygen, and we had triethylene boride. Well, triethylene boride explodes with a very hot flame when it comes in contact with oxygen. Okay, so what were we using that for? That's how we lit the fuel off. So next slide. There's the standard, starting it in the hangar. We'd lift up the front and the back of the hangar and crank in the hangar, and then we'd come out from there. Next slide. This is the chine. This is the part I was talking about. A little bit below that arrow, you can see that flat part around. That is actually a lifting body. We flew around at 4 to 5 degrees nose high when we were flying at speed at Mach 3 or better. Next slide. There's the stand again. Next slide. They're helping us get in the airplane. So when they get you in the airplane, they hook up all the oxygen leads and all that kind of stuff. And then you close the visor down, and that seals, and now you're getting oxygen in the just around the face area. And one of the guys did not hook up the oxygen right. So when I lowered the visor, I couldn't get anything right. And I'm in there kind of panicking around, trying to tell him that I'm not getting any oxygen, and trying to get the faceplate back up. And it actually locked down here, and you had to twist it and then pushed it up to get the back up. So I was not happy. Next slide. They're still lashing them in the airplane, or getting out of the airplane. Next. There's me, fearless. And I haven't lowered the visor then. This is called the Baylor bar, that bar that's going up around the top. And that's the one that locks down and has the, that you have to get it up with, you want to breathe. Next slide. Next. So, next slide. This is the B model. So we had a B model that had a raised canopy in the back, so that when you went off on your first flight, you had a guy that already knew how to fly the airplane. He rides in the back, you're in the front. The bad news for him is you can't see the land. So you make the first landing. So whether you're good or bad, you're going to make that first landing. Next slide. That's again the B model. Next slide. These are all the things that the maintenance guys went through before you took off. Pretty amazing. These guys were all hand selected, all the maintenance guys out there did a great job. The next slide. Next. Next. This is a start card. Okay, so I told you that the fuel won't light off, and I told you that I had the triethylene boride that it's exposed on contact with oxygen. So what we did was we had the Buicks over there, the Buick Start, and the Buick Start, you'd get them to rev the engine up, and when you got it up high enough, then you would throw the throttle up into the idle position. When it did, it fired triethylene boride. It ignited on contact with oxygen. So I got liquid oxygen and triethylene boride, not a good combination. And that's how they started. So they called it a Buick Start because they were using Buick 400 cubic inch engines in it, okay? It was a good engine. They had 4-bolt mains on it, really a nice engine. And we ended up using all the 400 cubic inch engines we could find in junkyards and everything else. So after that, they went to the Chevy 454 engines, and they still called it the Buick Start. So when you talk about a Buick Start, it was still, even if they had Chevy engines, it was a Buick Start. And the guys, the maintenance guys, they loved this. So you got two of these 454s on one side of you to crank up the right engine, and two on the left side to crank the left engine. These had straight headers in it, And so they got these things up 5,000 RPM. They're screaming out there in a hangar with this thing. It was so manly. I mean, I really felt good when it went off, and it was manly. We went to an air start later on, and it just wasn't the same thing, you know, it just wasn't the same. And when they shut the Buicks off after you crank the engines, you thought the engines had quit because the Buicks were making all the noise out there. Next slide. There's the start cards. You can see they've got the yellow spark plug wires. They got chrome valve covers. They dialed these things up. They look great. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. And there's again, talking start. This is kind of when this guy's just now introducing the fuel. You can see that flame coming out the back when he puts it in there, when that triethylene boride ignites. Next start. And there's, again, the triethylene boride. That's that orange flame you're seeing that's firing up the engine. Next slide. And taxiing out for takeoff. Next slide. Okay, the tires on the airplane were, they had nitrogen in them, and they were very, very small tires. And it's a big airplane. So you got a 60,000-pound airplane, and they would fuel it up with just enough gas for you to get to the air refueling to air refuel it. So right after takeoff, you went right into air refueling. But even with that, this airplane did not have enough tires down there to really stop well. So we had drag chutes and everything else. And we also had an electronic barrier at the end of the runway. And when you taxied on the runway, they would tell you, you know, hey, the barrier's armed, and they only armed it for us. So if you went into the overrun at the end of the runway, and as you went in the overrun, the speed sensors would say, you know, hey, he's doing 50 miles an hour. And it would throw up the cable to get you right in front of the mains, because if it went in front of the nose gears, it'd break the nose gear off and the whole airplane come down. So it was a pretty fancy system for us stopping. So they're nitrogen at 425 pounds per square inch. There's some pretty amazing tires. And they were silver, and as you used them a little bit, then they got black, so it looked like you had white sidewalls out there. It's kind of cute, yeah. And then we got out in the last chance, and they would chain us down, and we would do engine runs before we took off. So we'd run the engines up, and you could actually, in flight, adjust the temperature of the engine, which I've never heard of that on any other airplane. So you could sit there and work with the EGT, exhaust gas temperature, on the engines. And you do all the engine tests and all this, and then they'd cut you loose and you're ready for takeoff. Next slide. And you start and take off. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, back up one. Can you back up? Okay, so I'm out there, and we had a crew that would come out and pre-flight the airplane because you couldn't walk around it. And the airplane leaked like a sieve. You probably already heard about all the fuel that would pour out of this thing when it was just sitting there. So you didn't want to be walking around getting in the suit and getting that. Plus, you couldn't see much anything with that helmet on. So they had the pre-flight crew out there. So the pre-flight crew gets out there, and the guys on the pre-flight crew said, hey, Cal, we got these 2 3-star generals out there. They're in the van with us, and they want to see a good takeoff. And I said, hey, no sweat. I'll give them a good takeoff. So they cut me loose, and I told Frank, I said, hang on, Frank, I can really show these guys what it's all about. So, roll down the runway, at 180 knots, you start rotation, and it would lift off at about 210. And you can see the gear on this thing are very long. Okay, so right after takeoff, I retracted the gear, and then I put the airplane lower than it was with the gear. So we were just streaking along on the ground here. And right at the end of the runway, I pulled up really, really nose high, okay? Right as I was finishing up this maneuver, I get fuel low pressure on both engines, and I'm going, oh, you are an idiot. And we had automatic clearance at 22,000 feet so that we go right into air refueling. So I'm pushing forward on the stick, trying to get the nose down, and I'm telling Frank, I said, Frank, tell him I'm not going to be able to level off at 22,000. Give me clearance up at least at 28,000 feet. I'm trying to get the nose down because I'm afraid I'll lift that fuel off and flame out both engines. Fortunately, I was able to get the nose back down at 28,000 feet. We descended back down to 22,000 feet. I'm up there completely drained in the front going, God, I will never do anything that stupid again. I swear, I don't care what it looks like. Okay, so next slide. This is a normal takeoff. Me, I was still on the runway streaking down through there. Most airplanes, like all civilian and commercial, you have a speed limit of 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Fighters in the Air Force and the Navy can fly at 300 knots below 10,000 feet. We could fly at 400 knots below 10, so we could really streak around when we were low altitude. Okay, next slide. And he's climbing on up, trying to get his gear up. Again, I was just barely off the runway. Next. 26, 27-foot flame coming out of the back of the airplane. Really, really good stuff. Okay, so when you start down the runway, there's a runway in front of you, and they never lit together. So you throw both of them in a minimum afterburner, and then when they both light, throw them in the full afterburner. But when they light off, the airplane would veer off to that side of the runway. So this engine lit, and it pushes you off towards the side of the runway. So you don't do anything. Because if you correct, when the other one hits, you're going off this side of the runway. So you just left it going down the runway like this, and the other one hitting it straighten up, hopefully. Okay, next slide. There we go. We go right into air refueling. So without a doubt, this is the most difficult airplane in the Air Force to air refuel. And the reason is that as you're taking on fuel, and we would take on around 80,000 pounds of fuel, as we were taking on the fuel, the airplane would finally, and the tanker's running flat out. He's going as fast as he can go, and we are starting to not have enough thrust because we're not in afterburner. So what you did was, what you're supposed to do, is you're supposed to disconnect from the tanker, come back into what they call, all of a sudden I got louder here, into what they call pre-contact position, and go in the afterburner on one engine, and then refuel with the other engine. So the one that you had in idle is the one that you're moving. So as you're air refueling, here's a tanker flying like this, and you're down here, and every time you add thrust and all that, it's going like this. It's really a bad scene, especially if you're in the weather or something like that. It was really, really hard on you. But that was what you were supposed to do. Real man lit up right on the boom. So as you're starting to come off, as you're starting to run out of thrust and you're hitting the stops, you take the left throttle and you put it in the min afterburner and you count 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004. At 4, no matter what, you take the right throttle and pull it to idle. About that time, the left one would kick and the airplane would go up like this with you, and you would continue the refueling. That's what real men did. Okay, so the next slide. There he is. These lights, actually up here, are the lights that tell you where the receptacle is behind you. So those lights tell you your position in the air refueling, and one was fore and aft and up and down, and you would watch those lights, and that would tell you your position. Okay, next slide. 12 minutes to take off to 85,000 feet and Mach 3.3. This bitch would really climb. I've gone through 60,000 feet and see in excess of 6,000 foot per minute climb. Next slide. There's a guy coming in refueling. Next. That looks better. So you can see it's way behind you where the receptacle is. Next slide. There it is from the tanker. This is what the air refueling guy sees as he's refueling you. Next slide. None of these show it with the guy in afterburner. You know, we didn't. I don't see any slides. I couldn't find any slides that showed it with when you're fueling with the afterburner on. Next slide. It's a nice picture. Next slide. Okay. So how is the airplane able to do Mach 3 or Mach 2? Actually, we flew three different ways. We flew 2.8 Mach, 3.0, and 3.2. And I never heard of anybody ever flying 2.8. It was always 3.0 or 3.2. And that spike that you see in the top is fully extended. And down here it's fully retracted. So the spike controls the airflow, the shock wave into the front of the engine. So that shock wave, that spike comes back, the shock wave hits the spike, bounces up, hits the outside, and bounces into the front stage of the compressor. They have never solved the problem today of supersonic airflow through a jet engine. So you have to have some way to slow the shock wave down so that you can do that. So this airplane would probably do about 3.4 Mach. That's about as fast as much spike as you could get on it. Okay? So if some guy tells you he's doing Mach 4, Mach 5, not in this airplane. Okay, next slide. This is the temperatures you're looking at. So 327, you're talking 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Bake a cake with that. Back at the back of the airplane where you're seeing this right here, we're talking 1,000 degrees. So this is standard temperature when you're flying out there. So that's why you had the fuel that we're trying to cool down parts of the airplane being pumped around the airplane. Okay. So your first ride in the airplane, and nobody told you this, you're there because it was just kind of, we're going to trick him. So the guy, you're flying along, and your instructor would say, "Hey, Cal," yeah, he said, "put your hand on the glass up there." So you got the glass windscreen. It's pretty thick, look like about 1.5 inches. Put your hand on the glass up there. Well, you got on really thick gloves, and your mind cannot conceive that anything that's this close to you could be 600 degrees, right? It can't be. I'm comfortable, and it's 600 degrees. You put your hand upon it, because everybody did, and right away it comes right through. It was really, really hot. So, but you couldn't conceive that there was that temperature differential between the two. Okay, next slide. That's looking out the window. The guys will, it was dark out there, and the earth was really small, and up there at, 90,000 feet. Well, guess what? It wasn't. He's lying to you. It looked like this. It was a very dark blue. There wasn't any weather, obviously. Your weather stops at about 55, 60,000 feet. And he's in a turn. You can see the horizon out there. Next slide. It's kind of a cool slide. You can see the reflection of looking out the airplane going this way in his mirror as he's looking out there. So he had the camera here. He takes a picture of his visor and looking that way. This is that lock I was talking about that locks the visor down. That's the one that the guy, I almost strangled myself. This cable runs around your neck and goes down here, and you're supposed to really tighten it down real good, because that is, if your suit inflates, the suit is a little bit bigger than you are, and if the suit inflated, that helmet would try to push out over your head. So it popped the helmet over. And one of the guys had that happen to him and just about lost his nose with it. So you cinch that thing down so that if you had a rapid decompression, you wouldn't lose your helmet. Next slide. Again, this guy's taking a picture. Okay. So over on the left-hand side, about right there, is a little hole. And the little hole is so that you can, it's got a valve on it. And that's how you can drink a Gatorade or something like that, or eat your tube food. They had the tube food. They had beef stew, chicken stew, apple pie. You give apple pie. I don't know of any pilot that ever ate on the flight, just because you had your hands full. But the navigators could tell you about every one. If you want to know what meal was good, ask the navigators. They're back there just dining away while you're flying the airplane. On the left-hand side, the black is the bat wing. The sun was so bright up there that you had to get something so that you could see. And so you just move that bat wing around to keep the glare of the sun away from you. Next slide. That's kind of a cool picture looking at the horizon. You know, you could see a little bit of the curvature of the Earth, but guess what? At 50,000 feet and 45 or 40,000 feet in a commercial airplane, you can still see the bend there. Next. Okay, this is a drag chute. You had 3 drag chutes. So the first chute comes out, and it pulls the next chute, which is a little bit bigger, and then the big chute comes out, and that really, really would tug on the airplane when it inflated. So that was another thing they didn't tell you in training. So all the guys want to come out and watch your first flight, because in the simulator, it was a very old simulator with no motion in it. So you'd fly along, you'd land, you'd be air braking, which you just got the nose up going down the runway, bleeding off speed by pulling the nose up. You're not going to fly, but you got the nose up, bleeding off the airspeed. And then you'd reach up in the simulator, and you'd reach the drag chute handle, and you pull the drag chute handle. Of course, the guys didn't tell you anything about it, so you just pull the drag chute handle. Oh, great, stop the airplane. So on your first flight, which everybody out there watching, because they knew what was going to happen, you land, you air brake, you got the nose up like that, you reach up, you pull the drag chute handle, and when this thing hit, it really hit. So what happens is you're sitting there, you pull the handle, you put your hands like this on the stick, and then when it hit, boom, the whole front end of the airplane come down, it hit and it bounced, and you get on the runway bouncing like this, you know, right? And, you know, I got set up on this. Okay, guys. But, of course, you didn't tell the next new guys. Okay, next. And there's the big chute. One of the guys, the drag chute doors opened partially in flight, and when he pulled the drag chute handle, this big block of melted nylon popped out onto the run because it melted the whole parachute. So, next slide. And there it is. You can see the different chutes coming out. And he's air braking, got the nose up like that. Next. There's a big chute. But then again, we were doing 175, 170 miles an hour knots, which is like 200 miles an hour when we touched down. Next slide. Again, the chute. Next. It looks almost like he's in the air, but he's really on the runway. Next slide. You can see the other little chutes falling off. Next slide. That's a cool picture. Next. Hey, congratulations after my first flight. My instructor lived through it. And you can see the air conditioner coming over there. The air conditioner for the hands. Next slide. Okay, I always thought this was interesting. See the little white patch on the right sleeve, right above the hands? You know what that is? That is the instructions for how to get into a raft if you bail out over the ocean. They figured you would be so fried by the time you ejected and finally got down to the water. They figured you'd be so messed up that they put it right there so you go, release seat pan, okay? Got that. Open up the raft, make sure it's fully inflated. That was pretty cute. And that's Fearless Frank and me. Next slide. And everyone was signed by the man who built the airplane, or mainly responsible for the airplane, Kelly Johnson. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk some fun facts about the airplane. Obviously, I told you it leaked a lot of fuel on the ramp. If you sat there for like 2 hours waiting with some kind of mix-up or something like that, you were actually getting to the point that you might have to have them come over and put some more fuel on the airplane. It leaked that much. The average life expectancy of the mechanic's boots was about 3 to 4 months before that fuel had finally eaten his boots up where he needed a new pair of boots. So. had big trays under it. So they got these big metal pans under it that it leaked down into. And there was always a fire truck out there, and people thought it was in case, something caught on fire when we were starting the engines with all this other stuff going on. No. Fire truck was full of water, so that when we pulled out of that hangar, which you saw both ends up, when we pulled out, he would wash all that fuel out of there into a drain. So that's the reason the fire trucks were there. The oil in the airplane, we were looking for exotic oils and that would do certain kind of things because we were running so high temperatures and all this kind of stuff. The oil for the engines froze at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it was colder than 40 degrees, you had to get a heater out there on the oil on the engines so that you could crank the engines. Probably the most exciting thing about this airplane was that the faster you went, the faster it wanted to go. What do you mean, Cal? Well, if you had just a limited amount of fuel, not like your car, you just want to go fast. And the faster you went, the less amount of fuel that you would use. That doesn't sound right. Well, that's the way it was. So as the airplane went faster, it became more efficient. So it would start accelerating with you. And so, okay, I pull the throttles back to min afterburner, and this bad boy's still accelerating with me, so what am I going to do? So I'm going to climb. So I start climbing up and try to bleed the airspeed off in a climb and just get higher and higher, and finally you'd get to the point where the airspeed's coming back under control, and now you try to do better management of the throttles. So when they came out, when I'd come back from a flight, there would be 2 Lockheed representatives there, and there would be 2 enlisted maintenance people there who knew this airplane backwards and forwards. And they would pull up all these data feeds off the engines, and one of them was your altitude. So they'd see, okay, Cal went into a turn here, and he came out of the turn, and he didn't pull the throttles back quick enough. And so the airplane, he now is climbing. Okay, he's starting to run out of fuel. Now he's descending, and now he's got it there. And it comes right. Here's the next turn. The good guys could get it right. They'd know when to pull the power back and be more efficient with it. But me, I was always having to climb and descend because of speed. It had an autopilot, but the autopilot did not have an altitude hold function on it. So you're always playing with with whatever pitch you were working on, but you were always messing with that when you're flying up there. Remember that the only variable in Mach is temperature. So after about 60,000 feet, you're out of the standard lapse rate of 2 degrees centigrade per 1,000 feet. So after that, what you found in the upper atmosphere was bodies of warm air and cold air. So as you transition from one body into another body and the temperature outside of the air, maybe I should have listened to that weather guy. The temperature in the air changed. That was going to affect the Mach that you were going at, okay? So if it was warmer, the airplane was going to show that it was going faster, but you were not on the ground, you were not going faster. So warm air or cold air, because that's the only variable in Mach is temperature. I think I'm out of slides. Try the next one if there's anything there. Oh, there's the air fueling. And the navigator in the back had a little window on the side that was about like this that he could look out of. It didn't have a stick or anything like that. No way to control what was going on the airplane or anything like that. No throttles or anything like that. But he had an important role. And just like the pilots, the navigators were all hand selected. And I got a good one. Fearless Frank. I think that is the end now. Here we go. I think this is a little bit embellished. I don't think that's really I don't think anybody was that close, but sure looks good, doesn't it? Next slide. There we go. I'm pretty sure that's the end. So, that's all I got, guys.
Hey, Cal, how many states did it take to make a turn? Not miles, how many states did it make a turn?
Maybe one. It depends on how the state was shaped.
Going fast. What was the purpose?
That's the only purpose of it. The airplane could operate in a threat environment. So your chances of getting shot down were slim and none. Now, if you know anything about the ground-air missiles or air-to-air missiles, I mean, there are some that can do Mach 6 and all this kind of stuff. However, the problem is, when you think about it, is if he's at ground level and you're at 80, 90,000 feet and you're 18 miles up, he's got to launch that missile prior to you getting there to actually be good. So he'd need to launch a lot of missiles, because all you know, the minute he launches that missile, all you have to do is turn like 1 or 2 degrees. He missed you by a long ways.
Since you couldn't do any damage, why would they waste missiles trying to shoot you down?
Just trying to. Well, they got the U-2s, so maybe they thought they could get us. I don't know.
Cal, how long was the flight?
Okay, so the flight, we could go 2:45 on 1 refueling and about 4.5 on 2 refuelings. So we took on 80,000 pounds and we're burning about 40,000 pounds an hour. So it's a lot of fuel for just 2 engines.
Now, the cameras you had on board,
That was probably the most secret thing about the airplane.
that's what I was going to say. Did you know much about them, or did you know where you were flying over?
I knew what I was flying over. You got briefed on that, but I knew nothing about the cameras.
You never saw the photos themselves?
Oh yeah, you can see the photos. The photo. Okay, here's the deal. You're flying along and you're at 80,000 feet and you're in the clear and everything's great and all that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? There could be solid undercast of clouds. So we flew with a radar head most of the time. And so the radar head took pictures with the radar. And you could look at the film that they used, and they were more than happy to show you something. And the guy would say, "Oh yeah, that's a such and such tank," and you're going, "It just looked like a glob." I'm telling you, I could not, and neither could anybody in here unless they'd done it before, figure out what you were looking at. But those guys knew, and they knew exactly what was going on, and you didn't know anything. And the other thing that we gathered was what they call ELIN, which is electronic information. So if the radar site that we were going up against, if he started to turn on his equipment, then we would capture what frequencies he was operating on and everything like that. So if they actually shot at us, that was actually good information. And you know, some of the guys I never did, but some of the other guys, well, I got shot in a B-52, but that's another story. So you never knew, but they would call you up later and say, "Hey, you had 2 missiles fired at you." They didn't know anything in the airplane.
I just wondered, when you're going up there that high and that fast, were your missions pretty much about gathering information?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or getting the ELIN, the electronic stuff, by having them come up and try to find us or anything like that. We didn't go inside the 2-mile border of Russia or anything like that. So the U-2, he was, flying over Russia. We didn't do that. We did not fly over Russia, but we went over a lot of other places. And when the guys would go out and give talks, much like this, they would say, hey, if you want to find some valuable information and you have, 2 or 3 weeks to get the information, you can send the U-2. They're cheaper. They don't burn as much gas. Everything's better with the U-2 if it's non-threat, okay? Because in a threat environment, you couldn't send a U-2. If you needed a satellite and you had a week, you get the satellite in a geosynchronous orbit, and he could get the information for you. If you needed the information yesterday, call on us. So that's what we kind of said, as in a joking way, but not really a joke. We could launch that fast and take care of things.
The lifespan was seemed to be awfully short. Was it too complicated, or?
I'm sorry?
The lifespan of the airplane, according to the information it sent us, didn't last that long.
Well, they made it in the late 50s, and the last flights were around. They actually started this squadron up again it was right prior to 1990. So that's 40 years. That's pretty good. Here, and I know the guys involved in all this. The satellites wanted all the money. They wanted all the money, and our budget was $400 million a year, which is in big terms is not that much. Okay, but they wanted all the money, and they made the pitch that they could have the Dark Star. Anybody familiar with Dark Star? Dark Star was a reconnaissance vehicle, and they were going to use it in Iraq and all this kind of stuff. Well, Dark Star never went operational; it just crashed a bunch. So really, in that situation, they really could have used us, but we had already, we'd already parted ways, and we weren't flying. And then they brought the airplane back later on because they realized that it could do a better job. And nowadays, honestly, send a drone. Nobody's involved. It can stay up there for hours and hours. You don't have to worry about a thing. Drone's much better, cheaper, whole 9 yards. You can actually, put missiles on it, and do a much better job than we could do. So our days were numbered.
A local fellow named John Myers, born in Moon, ended up in Masonic Village, claimed to do a lot of the development work on cameras. It was top secret stuff, but he said he was trying to control the radiation the cameras would pick up. So he went down to the Southwest where they were doing the plane and talked him into painting the plane black around the camera. And he said they picked that up and painted the whole plane black. But that was his story anyway.
I'm not sure about that. I know that the paint was radar absorbing. That's what they were really looking for. And this was actually a stealthy type shape on it with all the rounded corners and all that kind of stuff. However, not as stealthy as what they did in later days. But it had a very low profile on a radar scope. So it did.
I'm sorry, I didn't know what you
The reason they're painted black,
Why are they?
why are they painted?
It was a radar absorbing paint.
Okay.
That's what they were looking for. And the plane's mostly titanium. So where do we get our titanium from? Russia.
Tony. Hello. I'm just wondering. I'm having a hard time getting my head around this stuff. But
Me too.
what's the point?
Strictly reconnaissance. Strictly reconnaissance. Now, however.
Reconnaissance. That's a lot of. Never mind.
Okay, so when they started, part of the thing was they were going to make an interceptor called the YF-12A. So they had the YF-12A, and actually there was some good development that came out of that. The missile system that they were going to use was what they started with came up and became the Phoenix system, which they put on F-14s, which is a very good system for launching missiles at defenders. But then when you look at this thing, let's see, we've got an airplane that leaks fuel all over the place. It has liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen, and TEB, which don't stay well. The liquid nitrogen, it's a liquid because it's so cold. So this is not anything that's you're gonna have to keep working at it to keep it there. And now we got to have our crews, our alert crews that are going to be flying these interceptors in a full pressure suit. This is not a good plan. So the YF-12A kind of bit the bullet on it. So,
excuse me. Question now. When were they taken out commission?
And probably right about 1990. That was the second time they reactivated the squadron. And
okay. Now, how many of those planes was built over the years?
I'm sorry?
How many planes were built over the years?
They said 32.
Now, what did they do when they took them out of commission? Put them in mothballs or destroy
Museums.
Them? Museums?
A lot of museums. They got them all.
Oh, so they didn't destroy anything. They just put them in museums.
No.
Like Wright-Patterson, is there one out in Wright-Pat?
There's one Wright-Pat. I've been seeing that one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, question here. What role did these planes play in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I'm sure that they flew over there, but I think at the time they were also using U-2s down there in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the U-2 could do a very good job. U-2 actually, that airplane got the real-time telemetry, and we didn't have that. They had data feed from the airplane back to the recovery system, so they could see what they were doing real time. We were too old for that. Because U-2's still flying.
Did you see anything unusual when you were flying up there?
No. The only one I had was in a T-38. Okay, so I'm flying a T-38 and it was nighttime, and I called up the local controller. I'm going, there's some really strange sights up here, and it kind of like an aurora borealis over there. It was a faint and mystical, and I couldn't figure it out. And the guy goes, oh yeah. Okay, so they had a launch today. I was at Moody. They had a launch today of one of the rockets down there, and those gases get trapped in between layers. And when it does, it gets that kind. And the sun was coming down. That's why I was seeing all the wild colors and all that kind of stuff. But so I never saw any UFOs.
Is this part of the Space Force?
No.
Still Air Force?
Yeah. Well, the Air Force, we shut down in 90, so, and I was long gone by then. I was flying at U.S. Air. Boring.
What was the service ceiling of the plane? And
you could about almost up to 90. It would depend on temperatures and everything else if you could get it to 90. 90 was about all she'd do. But when I was doing some of those, trying to get the airspeed down, maybe I hit 90 or so.
At what level did you get the astronaut designation?
I'm sorry?
What altitude?
Oh, it's like 200. It's a long ways. There were some rumors that we got astronaut wings. Nah. Less than 100 guys flew it as the pilots in command. So less than 100 pilots, and the ranks are thinning.
Anybody else?
Once you got up to altitude, how far could you see?
Long ways. Okay, so like, initially when you got up there, you had no. When you're flying in a commercial airplane and you look out the window, you can see it doesn't look like trains moving very much. 80,000 feet up there, you could tell you were moving. It's like mountain ridges or something like that, which were really well defined. You could tell you were doing 2,000 miles an hour.
Did they lose any planes? Any crew?
No, and none was shot. Wait, let me define this. There were airplanes that we lost, but they were mechanical issues or something like that. So yes, we did lose airplanes, but none of them were shot down. None of them were even hit. And but we had some interesting crashes. They didn't realize how critical the center of gravity is on the airplane initially. It just didn't. Now, it automatically goes aft. The faster you go, you need to move the center of gravity back. And it automatically goes back in the airplane. And they didn't realize right at the start that it was that critical, and they lost one of the airplanes in a turn. That's the one where the backseater was an engineer, and when he broke his back when he ejected, and it was quite the story.
Was the U-2 more vulnerable, obviously, than your plane? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Could it not do the same maneuvering to try to avoid something?
We didn't do any maneuvers. We just went fast.
Yeah, you did.
U-2 is just a sitting duck up there. That's anything.
What's the speed on the U-2 then?
Slow, real slow. It's a glider. Basically a glider with an engine, truly. And I mean, it's flying really slow. They're sitting there, at the peak of the Mach stall, Mach crit. They are right at the top of it. So they're flaming right on the edge with that airplane. And they were in the 60s with that airplane flying it. And long missions because it took them a long time to get anywhere with it.
Their defense was they were high.
Initially, until powers got shot down, they thought they were okay.
How high was that?
60, 65.
Hey, Cal.
But we get the reason we were immune was we were going so fast. It had nothing to do with altitude.
Let me ask you something about the ejection out there. Eject your seat if something happens. Was there an altitude that you couldn't?
No. We had full pressure suits. But I'm glad you brought that up. That's kind of interesting. So some of the airplanes, like the B-58, had kind of a wild ejection system and all of that. But the SR had just a regular, looked like a Martin Baker seat on it, if you're familiar with ejection seats. Looked like a Martin Baker. And as you bail out of the airplane, you would eject up, and then a small chute would come out of the seat and stabilize the seat. So you're just sitting there. And then when you got down to like 10,000 feet, then the system would go through, you would be kicked out of the seat, and your parachute would come on, okay? You hope. So what's going to happen initially is when you bail out, you've got all this moisture inside, you're going to ice over. So you're not going to be able to see, okay? So you're going to be sitting there going, wonder how I am. wonder if this thing is going to work or not, I'm a little bit nervous here. Okay, so you had to sit all the way down to 10, 12,000 feet when the system kicked you out of it. You had stirrups. You can see them in some of the pictures. The stirrup just fit on the back of your boot, and when you started the ejection sequence, it reeled your feet into the seat. Nothing with your arms. But now, if I'm trying to impress you, I would say, yeah, we hit Mach 3 in the climb, but we actually just held a constant speed. So the higher you go, the Mach goes up, okay? So we were holding 400 knots. So yeah, we hit Mach 3 in a climb, but we weren't accelerating or anything like that. We just hit it in a climb. So we were doing about 370 most of the time, 380 indicated, which, they talk about when you're ejecting out of a low altitude and even in an F4, F-15, F-35, you're talking, those guys are doing 600-700 miles. And we weren't doing that. We were doing like 370, which is not that much. So the suit was going to protect us, and it was going to take us down. So they wanted to. They said, these guys aren't going to be able to see. They're going to be nervous in there. What's going on and all this kind of jazz. So what we'll do is you had in your helmet, the glass in front of you had little wires in it, and you could defrost it, okay? Turn the defroster up on. He said, hey, we got the defrosters in there. We just put a battery in there. Well, battery technology back then wasn't what it was today. And they were looking at putting, all these batteries on the bottom of things. Nah, it's not going to work. We're just going to can it, and let it go. So the visors were made by Corning. And they made an initial run. Now, the Navigators, theirs were plastic, but they thought there would be some kind of refraction error or something like that with our visors, so ours were all glass. And Corning made a run of these glasses for it, right? Oh, over the years, we had busted one or two, and they were really, really careful when they're going, we're going to have to pay a fortune to get any more. They charged us a fortune on the first run. There's no telling what they're going to try to charge us on the next run. And then later on, they found out they could have gotten by with plastic, and it wasn't much of an issue with the glare. But
one thing, any other countries doing this kind of thing, like Russia or just us? You don't know?
No, I don't think they do much.
Oh, okay. I just was curious. Anybody else spending this much money to do whatever they do?
As far as the SR-71, did you ever get to the point where you were comfortable with it, or was every flight?
I'll go with the. So So when I changed airplanes commercially, which I obviously did a lot, they were initially you're going, and after a month or so you feel good. I never felt good in this thing. And that was always all those wire bundles. We talked about a temperature of the skin and all that kind of stuff. Well, they're running right through the fuselage up to my little instruments in the front, trying to tell me what's going on. So if you're flying along and your oil pressure on your engine goes to 0, okay? You put your hand over the gauge, count to 10. If the engine hadn't seized, it was the gauge.
Anybody else? We got, what, it's 11:15. Cal, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Good questions.